This is Space Minds by Space News. In this episode, co-host Mike Gruss talks with Tory Bruno, CEO of United Launch Alliance. We then discuss the latest news, including the success of Firefly Aerospace's Blue Ghost landing on the moon and other current commercial lunar payload services missions.
I'm joined today by Tory Bruno of United Launch Alliance. Tory, let's start by talking about Vulcan. It's been about 10 years since I believe you told the ULA board, possibly on your first day, that the company needed a new rocket. Since then, it's launched twice. I think maybe there were some concerns initially. It may be just a paper rocket, but walk me through that initial conversation and what you've learned in this process of building a rocket.
Yeah, sure. Well, the initial conversation was about the country's needs. So this was really being driven out of Congress. And in fact, really Senator McCain, who said, you know, we've had the Atlas rocket, which is powered by the Russian RD-180 rocket engine on its booster for many, many years, something we were asked to do at the end of the Cold War to keep those Russian rocket scientists from wandering off to Iran and North Korea. But the time has come to not be dependent on that anymore. And what really stimulated it was the recent invasion of Crimea. And so I went to the board and said, you know, I agree with the senator. It's time. It's time to move off the mighty Atlas. And therefore, you have to have a new rocket. He said, well, why can't you re-engine it? And I said, well, that's not how rockets work. The engine can either be designed for the rocket or the rocket can be designed for the engine. There really isn't anything available like anything like a drop-in. That's just not how it's done. And so we had long conversations about how long that would take and what it would cost and business case things. And of course, coming back to the nation's need. At that time, we were it. There were people starting new space launch companies at that moment, but really weren't able to fly the missions that the national security customer needed. So there really wasn't any choice here. We had to go do it. And it took a lot of business processes and disciplines around that and finding the right engine to get developed. But that's where we ended up, and you know, the rest is history.
What did you learn in that process? Because that's not something that every company gets to do or that every company gets to see come to reality. So what did you learn, and what would you say were some of the successes and the failures in that
Sure.
process?
Well, you know, I gotta start by admitting to you, this is not my first rocket.
Yeah.
I've developed probably, I don't know, 36 systems, and not even my first space launch vehicle. So in terms of that, you know, development process, that was pretty familiar to me. And I had even done agile development in the last couple of vehicles I developed before I came here, which we used on Vulcan, which is a new technique that is a different way of doing the systems engineering that lets you refine it as you go and maybe be a little bit faster. That's why they call it agile. But the part that I would say was new were all of the stakeholders, I'll even use the word, all of the politics associated with the choice of that engine. And it's one of the few times I would say that environment was pretty dominant. You know, I went out and surveyed the world, literally the world. Anybody who had a rocket engine in that class, even on a napkin, we talked to them, we evaluated them. We tried to see how we could make the finances work because it's pretty expensive to develop a new launch vehicle. All of that. And you know, I'll give you one story that was kind of painful. You know, we found a company that was in development for a rocket engine. It was a little less mature than the Blue Origin BE-4, but it was just the right engine, and they felt they had state backing for it, so we were going to be able to make all this work financially. And we liked the performance specs on this thing, and they even flew out. And I'm going to say this was I'm going to save the punchline for a minute, but this was an international partner, right? And so they came out and we spent like a couple of days with them going through all the technology and everything and feeling really good about it. When we finally got done, I said, I need to go in, close the door in my office, get on my computer and do some Googling here because this company's in Ukraine and I need to know exactly where they are located. And at that time, I think they were 20 miles from the border of conflict in the disputed zone. Today, they're on the other side of the border.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, that one's not working.
Doesn't solve the problem for you.
Did not solve the problem. And they were being cagey, like, I mean, I'll tell you, they had an address that was all the way on the other side of the country, but the actual factory is now on the wrong side of that front that is being contested. So anyway, so we went through that whole process and we ended up right where we are now, which is the right place to be with Blue Origin.
Can you talk a little bit about what long-term problems Vulcan solves and what kind of possibilities does it open up? I mean, I think obviously right now we're in this era where there's a lot of ambition for space. And so
Yeah.
how does Vulcan solve some of those long-term problems and not just the immediate near-term needs?
Sure. Well, I always try and look at the big picture. And sometimes, and I'll say especially in national security, that has a lot to do with the geopolitics that are transpiring in the world and where those trends are going to take our adversaries and what our country is going to need. And I was fortunate in this case because I did that here. And I'll say it's played out pretty much as I expected, with one or two exceptions. And Vulcan was always skating to that puck that I anticipated being here, 8, 9, 10 years away from where we started. When I came to ULA and had this particular challenge, the environment was very different in terms of national security. The customer had missions. They had missions that were important, but the focus was really getting by with a minimum solution that was as cheap as it could be. That was the whole focus. And there was no focus on peer adversaries or near peer adversaries. Those were imagined to be way off in the future. So it was just about, I'll say it, it was about coasting through and keeping the capabilities in place that were necessary for the country at that time. I felt that was not going to last, that this was going to be all about China, that China was going to be a problem for us a lot sooner than they imagined, and that it would unfold differently in space than the doctrine and the conventional thinking at that time. At that time, the thought process was that China was a couple of decades off as a serious problem for us, and that the real concern would be if there were regional or local terrestrial conflict like Taiwan, that it could escalate into space. And all we needed to do was to try and discourage that escalation. I knew that no, that's not what's going to happen. What will happen is a terrestrial conflict like that will start in space, absolutely start there, as a prelude to allow that terrestrial conflict and for an adversary like China or Russia, but really China, we're talking about China, to have the confidence and the boldness that they could level that playing field conventionally in order to seek whatever those goals are, and that Taiwan would be a nearer term problem. And I think everyone knows today that we're very focused on that now.
Yeah.
And that is the thinking. So I had a difficult decision to make at the beginning of this journey, which is, I think, really the root of your question. When you design a rocket, you have to decide what it's for. It can do a lot of things, but it has a mission that it is most efficient at. That means highest performance, lowest cost, most flexibility for that mission. And at that time, propagating even forward today, all the new vehicles are really designed for LEO operations in a commercial marketplace. They all are. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's where all the business is. I'll come back to that in a minute in terms of these low latency LEO constellations. And I felt that, well, that market will probably get served. And what the country is going to really need is a high energy orbit national security vehicle, because the problem with China is coming way faster than they think it is. And that was our heritage. It's what my team was good at. So there were other reasons to want to do that. But I made that choice. I go, okay, we're going to design this for the most difficult, in our world, it's the most difficult directly injected geo mission of a national security payload that there is. And that's where we'll be the most competitive and the most use to the nation. And we made that commitment. If you get that wrong, you come out of a development cycle 7, 8, 9 years later, X billion dollars without a viable product. So it's a big gamble, and it was a big choice. I believe, well, I know now that time has transpired, that we made the right call. So that's what it's for. That's what it does. It also gives us the platform to extend to what I think is the next serious need that will be required, which is real maneuver and mobility in space through space transportation, because this is an ideal platform to do that from. So still looking ahead a few years, I think you're going to see that become pretty important.
And tell me what that looks like. What does that, when you talk about that maneuverability, what does that mean? What does that translate to?
So today, as people think about it, they're imagining repositioning satellites, maybe servicing them. Some of that just because the need changes where they want it. Some of it's because they might be under threat. And the vision for that is spacecraft moving themselves around, or other dedicated spacecraft moving another satellite. And in terms of mobility, it's pretty limited. If we brought that to something, an analogy we might understand on the ground, it's kind of like having a bicycle instead of a car. It goes slow. It doesn't go very far. You can take 1 or 2 journeys and you're kind of tuckered out. And what we really need is to be able to maneuver at will as often as we want, as far as we want, and do it fast. And that isn't a satellite. That's a rocket, that's a booster, that's an upper stage. So because Vulcan is designed for the kind of mission that I talked about, it positions its upper stage for a mission like that very well. A LEO rocket, like all the other rockets, the booster is going to go sort of halfway to space, and it's going to hand over to that upper stage to finish the job, because it's done. It's done in low Earth orbit. I mean, it stages inside the atmosphere, only a little bit higher than the highest aircraft has flown. When you want to do this other mission I talked about, the booster's got to go all the way to space and drop off a stage up there still full of propellant, because the upper stage can't help you get to LEO. It's got to go from LEO somewhere else. That means when we're in space, we have an awful lot of energy. And so our future focus for Vulcan is, what do you do with that energy? How can we use that to solve these problems for national security?
I want to ask one quick question following up on that, which is, I know the Space Force is obviously counting on Vulcan for a series of national security missions later this year. Do you feel that Vulcan's on track for that? And that's the numbers that the Space Force laid out. I want to say it's 11 missions that's going to happen.
Yes, Vulcan is on track. It's actually been a pretty clean development. We have flown a couple times. The second time we flew, we lost a nozzle off of one of the SRMs. SRMs, by the way, are a clever thing you do in rocket design. And I'll come back to that in a minute if I remember. But losing a nozzle, it's like the only thing you can lose off a solid rocket motor and not care much. And the rocket didn't care at all. Vulcan was a beast. It just flew right through it. It was a minor impact on the total energy of the rocket. We understand what happened. We have corrective actions. We just did a big static firing in Utah to validate all of that. So we're back on track with that. So I'm feeling very confident about it. In terms of, flying how many times this year and how many missions, I'll have the rockets there because I never stopped building rockets while we were sorting through this stuff. I actually have a stockpile. I've got like 6 Vulcans. I've got over a dozen Atlases. I have
Yeah.
solid rocket motors, in the dozens. So if the satellites are coming, we're going to be able to go fly them. And we'll know as we get deeper into the year, how many satellites will be where they need to be. One of the things about national security space launches is that about half of the spacecraft end up needing to move right. And they move right by a lot. I won't even tell you how many months is
Yeah.
the average. And
They're delayed.
they're delayed. And why? Because they are exquisite technology.
Yeah.
In the commercial world, people look for really cool solutions with technologies that aren't actually that cutting edge. They're applied from something else, and that's what makes them innovative in space. Uh, but the national security satellites, oh my gosh, they are pushing the envelope on what is even possible every time a new generation comes out. That's why they move. And so
Yeah.
that's just part of the job.
You talked about never stopping to build these rockets, and I think you've shared a lot of those images on social media. And I think for the 10 years or so you've been at ULA, you haven't been shy about sharing your ideas and your thoughts. And particularly, I think some of your Medium posts have been very popular, but they're not kind of the cookie cutter LinkedIn copy that we often see from a lot of people. So I wanted to ask, what drives you to write, really lengthy pieces, I would say, about aggression in space or hypersonic weapons? Like, I think just, my core question is like, why is it important for you to do some of that writing and to share some
Well,
of these ideas that maybe are not, maybe they're launch adjacent, but they're not core to launch.
yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is they feel different because I write them myself. There's no professional writers. It's just me. So, apologies for grammatical and spelling errors. But so I do write them and I'm always writing it because I'm perceiving that there's a topic in front of policymakers and people who care about space or national security that is not being well understood at the moment. And so I feel that I want to help clarify it. And I'm a little bit unique in our world in that I have done so many different things over my career. I have a really deep background in nuclear deterrence. I have developed and fielded missile defense systems, space launch, directed energy, and I've built and flown a number of hypersonic gliders.
Yeah.
And so I have that technical expertise, but also from really, a policy, a systems engineering, a big picture view about what these things are for, how they work, and how you could use them. And so I feel like it's an obligation when I see something like that that is murky to people that I understand, and I only understand not because I'm smarter than other people, just because I've had just the fortune over the years to work across so many different domains that I can put those pieces together. And it's just a happenstance artifact of the career path I've journeyed through that I feel obligated to try and contribute. And so I'll write something like that to try and help. And sometimes people read it and get it, and sometimes they don't, but I've done my best.
I think the other thing that's been interesting about some of that is that you show maybe a little bit more of yourself than maybe some other executives might. I mean, you've talked about ranching a lot. You've written obviously about the Knights Templar in the past. How does some of these outside passions, and I don't think that's an exaggeration to say, but you have these passions beyond being a rocket scientist. How do they influence how you think about space and what ULA should be doing?
Oh yeah, geez, what a great question. Well, first off, everybody needs a hobby. And I feel space is so important to all our lives that it should be more transparent. And it really is people. People think of it as, I think oftentimes as giant institutions that are faceless,
Right.
or all the big monuments, we call them in the industry, the physical things that comprise the infrastructure that makes it happen because they're huge and they're billions of dollars. But really, none of that has any value without individual people who are committed to the missions and know how to do it. And so I want to make it human. And so I'm not afraid to do that and to, show people that no, the people who help keep our country safe and protect the weather and, explore Mars and all these things are just people, just like you. And everyone can aspire to be in this world. And, it's important to understand it and to understand the value of human beings in that, the human capital that makes it work. And, I think that the things that I bring to that in those conversations, they influence me and how I approach this work. You're right about that. Growing up on a ranch, you encounter all kinds of problems every day. You really don't have any money. You can't just solve them with money. I mean, it's not like Yellowstone. Ranchers are generally not affluent.
Right.
And by definition, you're also often a remote place somewhere, so you can't run and buy something. You just got to solve these problems. And it makes you creative and gives you a certain level of determination. And I think all of that has served me well over the years.
Um,
The Knights Templar is fun. It's the history of the Crusades are more um, dramatic and over the top and salacious than any Hollywood movie you've ever seen. The movies about them are actually kind of toned down because I don't think people would believe it. So it's super duper entertaining. And the part of the Crusades that I've written about are just very unique even within that. So you mentioned the Templars, right? So it's this weird amalgamation of religion and military activities, but also business. And so I take business lessons from one of these pioneering organizations as well.
yeah. All right, last question. We're just about out of time, but I wanted to hear what you think the future holds for large legacy defense contractors in space. Obviously, ULA is owned
Yeah.
by Boeing and Lockheed Martin. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm right now for the space economy, but I think maybe that enthusiasm is coming from different corners of the space economy. What obstacles do you see kind of standing in the way for some of these large companies like ULA, but not only ULA? And what do you think this space industry looks like in 5 years or so?
Yeah. Well, I would tell the big primes that what the country needs you to do now, what the market needs you to do today, is to go back to your roots in a lot of ways. When I was earlier in my career and working on these kind of systems, um, it was a different environment to be in. And it was, I would say, could be characterized by a willingness and an ability to very quickly, on moments' notice, throw together small agile teams by plucking people from places, put them on a problem right away that either needed to get solved by the company, needed to get solved by the nation. And then the cool thing about being at a prime in those days, apart from that agility, is those people were immediately plugged into tremendous technical depth. I mean, literally the world's experts on a whole host of technologies and phenomenon, so that they had the agility to be a little team working this thing while that deep, deep capability. And so if I were in that situation, I would look at that's what we need going forward because we're back in that kind of environment. And so I would look to invest more in technology. I would want to see for the big primes, I'd want to see them reconstitute their research labs. I worked in a research lab at Lockheed for a while. It was tremendous what could be done in there. And to bring more vertical integration back in. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a big movement in the defense industry, I think because of contraction, of, uh, of outsourcing things into a supply chain. Some things belong in a supply chain. It went way too far. bring that stuff back in, spend money on your own technical depth and expertise, put the labs back in place, and be agile to solve these problems.
I think that's a great place to stop. Tory, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. This was fun.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
All right, let's get started. David, some big news on the moon this week.
Yeah, I mean, we've had 3 private lunar landers heading for the moon just in the past week, and that has never happened before in sort of the history of space. We're talking about Firefly, Intuitive Machines, and the Japanese firm iSpace. And it's just we can kind of pick apart these individual missions, but it's just interesting in the context of all 3 of them heading there with some success we've already seen thus far, and the nature of the race, but also the nature of just a burgeoning global competition to develop a viable economy in that lunar presence. And more success begets, nothing succeeds like success, right? And contracts beget more contracts. And I just I'm curious what you think, Mike, in terms of all this, because this is almost like a flood the zone type of perspective now that we've seen this week.
Yeah, and let's start with Firefly. I mean, this is a huge milestone for the CLPS program, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, and that's just to catch people up. That's NASA's effort to give commercial capabilities to the agency to deliver more science and technology to the moon, but to do it at a lower cost. And so Firefly proved in this case it could work. And so I think this, my takeaway is obviously this is a sign that something like this could work, that it's a sign of we talk about this all the time, but a sign of the maturity of the commercial space industry. And, it's probably going to be used as evidence of the type of efficiency that NASA can use in the future. But it's a big moment. I loved what they said, that it was a small step on the moon represents a giant leap in commercial exploration.
Yeah. And if you talk with people at these companies, like, yes, there's competition. Yes, there's a primacy to that first mover advantage. There's no question about that. They clearly are competitive by nature. You can just sort of see the back and forth on social media, particularly on LinkedIn, in terms of, sort of the playful sort of jockeying that each company has in their respective workforce. But I remember talking last year to the folks in Intuitive Machines when another company, it was Astrobotics, Peregrine, was headed toward the moon just about the same time as this Intuitive Machines Nova C lander. And I mean, if you remember, there was a number of problems there that stemmed from that faulty helium control valve, and that basically required Peregrine to not make it, to sort of jettison their mission. And I remember thinking about this and talking to people about this, and it just there is something lost when there's only one company that does it, right? Because, like, can you build investor confidence? Can you build government confidence in terms of just a single company that lands near the lunar South Pole? But now that you have 3, and then you have China, sort of nipping at the heels with the Chang'e 7, Chang'e 8 missions coming up, it's starting to feel like something different now. I mean, is that your take, Mike?
I think so. And this sounds silly, but one thing is, social media is flooded with these NASA videos or the company videos of, hey, here's the control room and here's everyone clapping. Right. And you see that genuine emotion, and you see how hard people have worked, and it starts to you realize, like, this isn't just producing a widget, right? And I don't think anyone thinks it is, but you can tell that, hey, there's greater passion here in a greater project that everyone's working toward.
I think that's the kind of the neat thing about covering these things, is that when you're down in some of these factories and you're hanging out with these different technicians, and it's almost like this interesting combination of mechanics and physicists in the same room that are all trying to kind of reach their goal by sort of their own independent means, but collectively working together. And they worked together for years on this. Yeah. And then it's just, I mean, there's no like half stepping in this. Either you make it or you don't, and there's just almost jubilation in those control rooms, which are real, or not, which is also
Exactly.
quite real. And but the question I think that I always kind of wonder about as we talk about the nature of commercial space, it's a little bit of a misnomer, right? Because there is this the vast majority of these things are backed by federal contracts, and doesn't necessarily mean it's not a commercial space. But even when you look at SpaceX, which is by far the most prolific launcher and satellite company, like the vast majority of what underpins them are federal contracts. Now, that could change at some point, but my sense is probably not for a while. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think what this kind of, to me, what this raises questions about is, you know, what we're going through right now in Washington, which is like what should the size of NASA be? What should the size of the budget for some of these missions be for certain programs? And like, I think when there are efforts like this that succeed, I think there will naturally become questions like, hey, can't we do it this way again, or isn't it cheaper to do it this way again? And I think that federal government piece will be there. The contract piece will be there for a really long time. But I do think this starts to open the door to different ways of thinking about it, or open the door wider to different ways of thinking about it. And because of that, we'll probably see this approach, I would guess, over and over and over again in the coming 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, but because federal contracts underpin so much of this, and because NASA, is largely controlled by Congress, which controls the purse strings, and you have like real differences of priorities in terms of, you listen to Elon Musk and him saying that the moon is a distraction, let's go right to Mars, but you're hearing Congress now, which has been pretty clear about saying, no, let's stick to Artemis in terms of its existing structure, the moon first, sending back, Americans to the lunar surface by 2027. I think sort of the difference maker in a lot of this, though, is China, right? Because, I mean, China has those coming missions. The Chang'e 7 mission is planned for sometime in 2026. That's going to include an orbiter, a lander, even a rover. They've got plans now. They've sort of advanced their timetable, and they're sending astronauts or taikonauts there to the lunar surface by 2030. They've got plans, for their own International Lunar Research Station by 2035. The Artemis base camp is sometime in the 2030s. It's not quite clear. Questions about Lunar Gateway. Will that kind of go forward? I think that was supposed to launch back in 2022. Now it's 2028. So, changing of priorities in Washington. You see Doge sort of, looking for cuts. It's hard not to consider what the future of Gateway and SLS might be in terms of all this. And then how does that shape priorities in terms of human spaceflight, in terms of exploration, in terms of all of it, really? And it's almost like we're facing this dichotomy now in terms of traditional ways of doing things and the public backing that a lot of these companies have, and this sort of newfangled commercial era with the head of the most powerful space company having a very close ear in the White House. And it's not quite sure how it's going to play out, even for those within the agency themselves itself. So it's just an interesting time to be covering this and be part of this.
It is, and that kind of segues into our next story, which is it's all that's happening, I think, against the backdrop of, a lot of people have used the word trade war. Certainly revamped trade policy from the Trump White House. Obviously, there's a lot of talk of tariffs this week with Canada and Mexico and China. There's threats of additional import taxes, and I think we're starting to see discussions within the space industry about, hey, what is this going to mean in the near term? What is it going to mean for costs for satellites? What is it going to mean for costs for launch vehicles? And the short answer that people are giving is it's going to be expensive. It's going to be expensive to be a space company in the near term, and it's going to mean higher costs on imported raw materials and electronic components. And so I think that we talk about all that, and now there's an additional wicket to get through, which is this trade angle.
I was looking at before we got on here. I was just taking a look at Boeing, and Boeing's future in aerospace is, as we talked about before, is questionable in some ways, which is a whole different sort of can of worms to get into. But just looking at like their 737 commercial airliner, that 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 single plane has parts from roughly 700 separate suppliers, right? So the aerospace supply chain is inherently global. It's incredibly interconnected. Now, there's been a push in recent years for more vertical manufacturing. You've seen that at SpaceX and other companies, and you've also seen that at NASA. But it's hard not to kind of wonder, with this increased costs, does that reduce funding for R&D? Does that slow innovation? Do you have like a whole batch of new problems that you have to deal with in terms of managing production costs? I mean, you're looking at everything from like graphite and steel and aluminum and lithium ion batteries and just and oh, by the way, Tesla stock is down 30% for the year. Now this is maybe on the heels of expectations of tariffs, but a lot of that production is in China, but it all kind of ties together in a way. And so I just wonder in the sense of like being able to financially absorb some of these new costs and the capacity to use more homegrown products. Is that something you can do in the short term? I don't know. I really don't
Yeah,
know.
and I think that's what we've heard already is that a lot of the space business leaders are already kind of positing that, hey, the pain is going to be felt by startups. The pain is going to be
Yeah.
by those companies that aren't incredibly established, that don't have that deep record of contracts. So I think there's a couple takeaways from what we've already seen. One is that there will be more U.S. made components, materials, that there's going to be a push to use more US based manufacturers, that there could be a loosening of or more relaxed export control rules. Those things could help, but it's also expensive, and that could mean, like I said, this pain for the startups, and it could mean kind of rethinking supply chains to find the best fit, and that's going to be hard. And I think the lesson that we're seeing from some of these folks is, hey, we've been through this before. COVID was tough. We know that things are going to be hard, and that any company that's really thinking about this is not thinking of their supply chain or the trade regulations or tariffs as being set in stone. They may
Yep.
be, but they're thinking of it as, hey, this is what's going to be in place for the next couple of years, but we have to be flexible. We have to be able to have the agility to transform our business as needed. And maybe we're going to take a big turn, maybe we're not, but that's the thinking we're hearing right now.
I think also in the context of the economic moves that are being made, they also sort of reveal, and I say use reveal lightly because it's very clear in terms of what we've seen. Not only with regard to that press conference with President Zelensky and other press conferences, that we've seen in recent weeks, but um, a big part of the Artemis program seemed to be bringing dozens and dozens of countries together in a sort of unified effort to kind of create almost an undeniable sense that, these are the rules of the road, these are the governing structure in terms of how we orient in space. And, for rivals, when you look at Russia and China and others that fall into that vein, it was that sort of big coalition that they'd that would be facing, and it's sort of that duality that was kind of the question mark in this new age. And with regard to tariffs, with regard to sort of policies that are certainly not traditional in terms of U.S. foreign policy, I wonder how this now shapes the direction in terms of space policy as we go forward. At the same time, you have China that seems to be making moves in the diplomatic front. I mean, just recently
Yeah.
that they said the space station was going to welcome the first foreign astronaut from Pakistan, and been investing heavily within the Belt and Road Initiative, which is sort of that almost global emporium, and that sort of orients with Beijing at the center. And if you look at investment strategies in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, um, in tandem with some of these new diplomatic forays, it's really interesting in the context of like where the rubber meets the road here and sort of the next steps of global partnerships and what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting example because it gives China exactly what it wants, right? Like it's promoted as a leader in space. It has this kind of global view as, look at us, we're setting the direction here. And at the same time, it gives Pakistan this opportunity to say, hey, our space program is succeeding. Like we have the capability to develop and to be part of a bigger program. And it's, that's a really interesting development. And at the same time, it comes against the backdrop of, what we talked about a couple of weeks ago with Elon Musk saying, hey, maybe we should deorbit the space station in a couple of years. What we're doing is we're coming to a point where there's going to have to be a decision, and there's going to be a real contrast between what's happening internationally and what's happening with the United States.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks, Mike.
Great. Well, we want to hear from you. We want to hear about what you think about what's going to happen next with these lunar landers. We want to hear about what you think about the emerging trade policies that are happening. And you can do that by shooting us an email at spaceminds@spacenews.com. I'm Mike Gruss.
And I'm David Ariosto. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time here on Space Minds.